I was teaching at a small community college in Michigan. I loved teaching. I always wanted to be a teacher. My wife had a lot of school debts. We had two young boys, and the money I made teaching couldn't pay the bills, honestly. I did it for 3 years, and I said, I got to find something that pays a little more money. So I took a job, actually, as a speechwriter for a pharmaceutical company, the Upjohn Company, and that led into a 21-year career in public relations. I never imagined it would. My intention was to save money for a few years, go back to school, get a PhD, and teach. But that led me into public relations, and I had a great career that took me all around the world, which I thoroughly enjoyed. The reason I left the corporate world was I had been in it for 21 years. I had achieved a lot, but I was at a point, age-wise, late 40s, where I thought, if you're ever going to go back to school and get a PhD and teach at a university, you need to do it now. So I left, as I said, at a fairly advanced age, went back to school, got a PhD at Kentucky, and began teaching at the University of Alabama. Some of the accomplishments that I think I'm most proud of and that frankly I enjoyed were team-related kinds of things that I did with others. For example, in the early 1980s, I became public affairs manager for the Upjohn Company in Brussels. And my primary responsibility was to develop a public affairs council for public relations, Upjohn operations in 10 countries in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So I pulled that together, and we very soon became an effective team there. And frankly, that was the introduction for me to diversity, the concept of diversity. Nobody was talking about it 30 years ago. But 10 different nationalities of people on that public affairs team. And the accomplishments that I think we made together and how much we learned and understood from each other and realized very quickly, hey, the 10 of us can do a lot more and a lot better than any one of us individually within a country. So I was very proud of that accomplishment. It was a great learning experience for me. There was a similar one later at Whirlpool, probably a decade later there, when one of my assignments was to develop, implement, and evaluate the company's first global strategic employee communication plan. The company had expanded into Europe, Latin America, and Asia, and I was charged with doing this, so I put together again a cross-cultural team of folks from 8 countries that we had. We had other teams that were working for us, but again, it was this global team, this cross-cultural team that developed an incredibly successful employee communication program for the company. So those are a couple things I'm most proud of because, in fact, they involved working with different people on some tough issues. Those were difficult ones, especially the global employee communication plan. And we became great friends out of that. That group that worked on the global project, we're all retired now, or mostly retired. We still have a reunion every 3rd year somewhere around the world because we became very close friends in the process of that work. I think some of the qualities or values or characteristics that have been important for me in my career, I would start with passion and energy, if you will, for what I do. I mean, I love teaching, I love being in practice, and I think passion and energy for anything you do. And I don't mean you have to be a cheerleader, but you can have a burning passion inside. But something that you love doing is really important. The second one would be I'm an individual who has a lot of empathy for others. I mentioned some of the team projects that I'd worked on. So I think passion, energy, empathy, discipline, and focus. Great lesson for me from my couple of years of military experience was the ability to be disciplined and to focus on a mission. And that becomes really important, certainly in the corporate world as well. What is your mission and how are you going to accomplish it? So I think those are 3 things that have been important to me. Well, I think for students, things that I believe might be important to them are some of those same things. In fact, I often tell students, you've got to do something you have some passion for, that you have energy for. There's nothing greater that you can bring to an employer or to an interview than to demonstrate positive energy. Bring that to work, bring that to the interview, and you're likely to be successful, okay? So that, I think, is really important. I think they need to be good critical thinkers. I think this is kind of a gap in our world today is good critical thinking, and so I think that's important for students. Listening and other personal kind of communication skills I think are really, really valuable, that are sort of apart from or outside of the major field that they study in. if I think about who's had the greatest influence on my vision, if you will, for leadership, it's two people, it's two women. And one was my mother. My mother was a school teacher many, many years ago, and I once asked her, I said, Mom, did you have a philosophy for teaching? And she said, yes, I did, and it was this. She said, every child who walked into my classroom represented a bright promise, and it was my job as a teacher to try to bring that promise to life. The other lady who had a lot of influence was actually my first boss in public relations, Margaret Lee, at the Upjohn Company, a wonderful young woman who died way too early from cancer. But Margaret was probably the best listener I've ever met. She was incredibly empathetic, and her total focus on being a leader was literally being a servant. She was a classic example of a great servant leader. What could she do? She focused on how she could help her employees, her team members, learn, grow, develop, be successful. How could she do that? And as I talked with her about leadership, she said, it's an incredible responsibility, but it's also one that has great rewards. And one of the greatest rewards, she said, if you're a good leader, you can make a positive difference in the life of your team members, on the job, in the community, in the profession. So the notion of, bright promises that people hold, and the notion of trying to make a difference in their life, that's had a lot of influence on how I see leadership. I'll mention the 3 or 4 key issues I think in the field today. One of them is certainly technological changes, the technological changes that mark almost everything we do in communication, and just generally in our lives as well. So I think that's a big issue, trying to stay on top of that, trying to manage it. There's lots being written about data analytics and big data, and what do you do with it? And it's pretty overwhelming. Okay, so that's a big influence, I think, on practice today, or a big issue. Diversity in the field is a big issue, a growing issue that needs to be dealt with in ways that it hasn't been dealt with yet. I think the issue of ethics may be the central issue of the day for us in terms of how we deal with ethical dilemmas. Honestly, I'm always amazed not by companies and organizations that report crises, because many of them do and many of them experience crises. But I'm always wondering, now, where are the public relations folks on this issue? Are they involved? I'll give you one concrete example, the recent Wells Fargo crisis. This was something that affected some hundreds of employees in that organization. So it was known what was going on, at least in some parts of the organization. So I'm wondering why somebody didn't step forward sooner, and I'm wondering why some of the people in public relations might not have played a larger role. Now, I don't know enough about it to have any kind of an answer to it, but that's the kind of question I think of when I think about ethical dilemmas today. Regarding the current ethical state in our profession, I think it's really a central issue right now. I'm not sure that we're on top of it. There was just a new call by one of the leaders in the field for a new code, a tougher code, a way of self-policing the industry better. Well, actually, for the Public Relations Society of America, half a century ago, they had a very strict code. They had this self-policing function, but in the end, it was largely ineffective because nobody wanted to punish somebody else in their same profession. Okay? So it's a huge issue in this age of distrust and fake news and dishonesty. How do we deal with those issues inside our organization? So the ethical dilemma, I think, is for our profession and its future is really a central one today. Some ethics, or ethics in some senses, can be taught today. For example, we can teach people to understand codes of ethics in practice. We can teach people to understand moral reasoning, how you make decisions when you confront ethical dilemmas. We can teach people based on actual case studies that we might review, okay? So we can teach people certain things, but it's more complicated than that, and it goes back finally to self. Each of us in the public relations profession really has 4 dimensions that we have to deal with, or that are part of us in making decisions. One is our self orientation, ethical orientation. We have our own individual values. The organizations we work for, number 2, have a set of values and ethics. The profession in which we work has a set of ethics, a code of ethics and practices. And societies within which we work have them as well. So there's really 4 dimensions, or 4 sides to ethical dilemmas. And I think the most important one is the individual dilemma. That's where the action takes place as you will. I would always tell my students in class talking about ethics that the first time you confront an ethical dilemma is the key time. That's the big decision-making moment. Because most students, most professionals draw a line in the sand and say, I will not cross that line ethically, if you will, or morally, okay? So the first time you confront that and you're staring at that line, if you make a bad decision, the first time, then the second time it's easier, and the third time it's easier yet to make that decision. And finally, there's no line in the sand anymore. Lots of big changes in the PR industry since I began my career. I think the biggest one, of course, are technologies in every sense of the word. There's a great deal more in education today, good educational programs, that 40 years ago, a few existed, but there was not much being done in the way of education. I think the volume and the quality of research about public relations practice is great today. Again, comparatively speaking, 40 years ago, there was very little of it. I think the recognition for what public relations does today is better than it was. It's not perfect, but better than it was. So I think those are four big changes. New technologies touch every aspect of practice, literally, as well as our lives, personal lives. New technologies, we think about the volume of information that is available to us, the pace of that information that's available to us, data, big data, how that implicates messaging, how it implicates strategies, particular plans, how we evaluate things in organizations is based on technology, how we do things. So it's had a dramatic effect on virtually every aspect of practice. And I can remember talking with others 20 years ago when people said, it's just another channel. You know, those social media, for example, are just another channel. But of course, it's much more than a channel. Trends emerging today or developing today that are going to affect the profession in the future, I'll go back to, again, technology, the significance of that. I think concerns today about trust and truth and honesty and ethics, I think that's going to become a bigger dynamic all the time in what we do. I think it becomes a bigger issue for us to wrestle with as professionals. I think figuring out how to be even stronger counselors for the leaders that we consult with and deal with is an emerging issue. And of course, the issues of diversity are something that are very pronounced today, but they're not going to disappear. They're going to become more significant, I think. In this age of integrated marketing communications, if you will, I think it's really important for public relations people, frankly, to be better, to be bigger, to do a better job. I think we've made tremendous progress in terms of convincing people inside of the organizations of the value of public relations. Now, the image of public relations publicly is bad and maybe always will be. The more important dimension to me is how do people inside your organizations view the value of public relations? And the only way we can improve and continue to maintain independence, if you will, or the value of public relations is to demonstrate it. To demonstrate it on the job, to demonstrate that we do add value that certain other approaches in integrated communication don't. On the other hand, at the same time, we need to realize, and this is sometimes difficult for us to do, is that we are part of an integrated communication effort in the organization. So we need to do a better job maybe of integrating ourselves with and working with the other communication functions. I met Betsy Plank in the 1990s, I think the early 1990s, at a conference, PR conference. I only had a chance to speak very briefly with her, and we promised we would communicate more. Well, we didn't much, okay? But I first met her there, and then I joined the Alabama faculty in 1999. And the dean of the college at that time met Betsy in Chicago at some event. And he came back to me and said, do you know Betsy Plank was a University of Alabama graduate? I said, yes, I did. He said, we got to get her back down here. She hasn't been to the university since the 1960s, I think, or some long time ago. So he said, I'd like you to pull together some kind of an event to get Betsy down here. So we put together a 2-day event that we called the Betsy Plank Forum to bring her back to Alabama, to talk with students, the local PRSSA chapter, to make presentations. We did an industry roundtable while she was there to sort of get her reacclimated, if you will, to Alabama. And that was really the beginning of her much more significant involvement with the university and with the Plank Center, of course. My favorite memory of Betsy Plank, I've got a couple, but there's one that is most vivid and powerful. In 2007, at the PRSSA conference in Philadelphia, it was the 40th anniversary of PRSSA, and I had worked that summer with her to produce a booklet called Legacies of Legends in Public Relations, brief messages from 40 legends in the field, if you will, that we were going to present to the PRSSA students at the conference in Philadelphia. And so here I am with Betsy and with 8 or 10 students and these boxes of 1,200 booklets that we had to place on the dinner table for each student before the students came in. So we're sitting, waiting by the door, waiting for somebody to unlock the door. It's getting closer and closer to dinner time. And there was a great big door. It was barred, and I went up and I knocked on the door and I tried to push the bar. It just wouldn't open, and nobody would respond. Betsy got increasingly frustrated waiting on somebody to come. Now, she was at this time 80 years old. She had a bad arthritic hip, okay? Betsy finally said, "I'm going to open that door." And she climbed up and with her cane walked to that door and literally took her hip and threw it against the bar on the door. Now, when she did that, the door magically opened. And this huge security figure, this guy, stood in the background, opened the door, and she said, "Sir, unbar the doors and step aside. My children and I have work to do." Now, whether he, at that exact instant happened to open the door, I will never know. Never know. But to see that lady walk up there, so passionate about things, throw her hip against the door and have it pop open was a memory I'll always have. 2 things that I think people can take away from Betsy and learn from Betsy are, one, her mentoring willingness, her mentoring heart, if you will. She would, again, I'll give you another example of Betsy. This was at the conference in Philadelphia as well. We were walking somewhere to go to a session, and this young lady came up and introduced herself to Betsy and started talking to Betsy. And Betsy said, "Well, let's pick a time." And then she said, "No, Bruce, you go on ahead to the room. I'm going to sit down and talk to this young woman." And she did. 60 minutes later, she was still sitting there. She had incredible interest in mentoring and understood the power and value of mentoring. And so I think that's one important thing we can take away. And the second thing closely related to that are her listening capabilities. She's somebody who, when you talk to them, you know that you have her attention. She is listening to you. You can tell when people are or aren't listening to you. With Betsy, it was very obvious. So I think those are 2 great things we could take away. Betsy Plank was very passionate about, as far as I know, always very passionate about public relations education, public relations students, public relations research, and the profession itself, the advancement of the profession. Huge professional advocate. She was one of the founders of the Public Relations Student Society of America. She was the first woman to co-chair the Commission on Public Relations Education in the United States. So those are issues that she held then. Were she alive today, she would continue to be a passionate champion for education, research, the profession, mentoring, and diversity as well today. If Betsy were building her career today rather than half a century ago, one big thing would be different. She'd have to learn how to use a computer. That woman refused to learn how to use a computer. When I was the chair of department at Alabama, 2 different people I sent up there, technicians, specialists, to teach her how to go online and how to do email and those kinds of things. She ultimately refused to do it. So, okay, I'm kidding. That's one thing that would be different. She would have to be more technologically oriented than she was. Otherwise, I think many of the same qualities and characteristics that embodied her half a century ago would still be very much with her, and that's her passion and love for the field and students and education and diversity. If I hadn't had a career in public relations, I would have been a teacher. I was a teacher. I'm a teacher now, so that was something that I always wanted to do. The other thing, if I weren't in the profession, is I love to write. I would be a successful best-selling novelist, or would have tried to in any case. I think through my career, what's been important to me and what I would like to be remembered for, maybe the biggest thing is the importance of feeling passionate about the work that you do. And I think people sense that I've worked with over the year, and I think they feel it, and sometimes it moves them, I think, to do more. The other thing, I think, another quality that I would like to be remembered for is that I was always there. I was always available to students and to professionals literally any time of the day or night if an issue came up. And they knew that and would sometimes take advantage of that. But being there, I think, especially with students, is really, really important because that builds trust. I think if you're available, then people trust in you more. And I think the other would be kind of what I would call the legacy of the team. I believe so strongly in the importance and power of the team. That's how things get done, is with a good team. So I think those are three things that would be important. What constitutes a good education in public relations? I'm going to respond to that, and then I'm going to change one little word there, which I think gives us a different sort of view of it. A good education in public relations, I think that's available today, most places. We have in this country, and it's all developed over the last 40 years, we have any number of major universities. We're sitting in one of them, DePaul, okay, that have terrific education programs about how to write and design and edit, develop strategic plans, develop messages, do research, evaluate. We have programs that we didn't have 40 years ago that are teaching public relations majors how to do things that are really, really relevant for the profession, things that they need to get a job. So a good education in public relations, I think we're dealing with that pretty well. Now, if I take out the word in and not say good in PR education, but say good for public relations education, then we're looking at something that's bigger. Okay, it's not just those core courses that I mentioned, but it's other pieces that are involved to make you a better leader and a better person. For example, we do very little in most programs in terms of listening skills. It's in nobody's major. We know that that's one of the greatest issues in the world today, is people are not good listeners. We're all guilty of that. We're not good. But most universities have a listening course or training and development that you can take that we don't get. So I think that would be valuable. I've talked earlier about some of the major ethical dilemmas today, which is also related to me to the ability to think critically in our courses. And we don't teach that much. We talk about ethics and the importance of it, and we teach ethical codes. But how do you think through things? How do you critically evaluate things? Or one area that you can study in that deals with critical thinking and ethics is philosophy. Do students take a course or two in philosophy? I don't know of any better courses to expand your mind, if you will, okay, or to learn how to think strategically and critically. So I think we can add that dimension. We can add the listening dimension. We can add team leadership skills and development that, again, we don't usually get. So there are other areas, other non-sort of PR major focus areas that I think really enrich and broaden. And so what I'm speaking to some extent, and this is a reflection of my own undergraduate studies, was, liberal arts education, humanities study. There's some value in doing that. So I think as we look at a PR education, a good PR education, we need to think a little bit beyond the practical, mechanical courses that exist in the major today. Public relations professionals, do they share a persona? I've heard, I think, both sides of that. My own feeling is that they don't. They don't share a common persona. Okay? They are different. People are diverse. I know many, many leaders and professionals in the field. They're different. They have different styles. They have different values. They have different forms of self-presentation. They're not all happy and cheery at all. Okay? So they have different personalities. So they don't really have a common persona. I think what they have in common is a love of, fascination with, belief in the importance of words and language and communication inside and outside of organizations today. So they share that rich belief in or value, but I don't think there's a common persona. you.